My dad said my wife wasn't welcome. Then he met her father. Matthew Collins, 35, a software designer with a quiet but confident presence, thought he had finally found peace. After years of complicated family dynamics, he was ready to introduce his new wife, Nina, into the fold. A brilliant, grounded woman with deep values and a calm strength. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. His father, Richard Collins, a proud and conservative businessman, made his feelings known the moment he heard her name. "She's not part of our world," he said, "and she's not welcome in my house." But Matthew had learned not to flinch. Instead, he made one request. "Then meet her father, just once." When Richard finally agreed, expecting another outsider with nothing to say, he found himself face-to-face with Ernesto Ramirez, a quiet man with iron in his spine and history in his eyes. A decorated military veteran, a respected entrepreneur, a man whose dignity didn't need to be spoken, it was felt. What follows is an emotional clash of generations, values, and unspoken wounds. But in the silence between words, something shifts. And as old judgments unravel, new truths begin to surface. In this story of confrontation, humility, and unexpected respect, Matthew learns that family is not defined by who accepts you first, but who is brave enough to change. If you believe in second chances, breaking barriers, and the power of unexpected respect, don't forget to like and subscribe. Matthew's story is just beginning, and what comes next might surprise everyone. Chapter 1: The Announcement. Matthew Collins stared at the text message glowing on his phone, his thumb hovering over the reply button. The San Francisco morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds of their Hayes Valley apartment, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. Outside, the city was awakening, cable cars clanging in the distance, the scent of fresh coffee drifting up from the cafe below. "Just tell him, Matt," Nina said softly from the kitchen island, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, wisps framing her face. She wore one of his old Stanford sweatshirts, sleeves rolled up as she prepared their Sunday breakfast, her father's recipe for chilaquiles, the aroma of toasted corn tortillas and roasted tomatillo salsa filling their home. "But my dad isn't like yours, Nina," Matthew replied, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. "Richard Collins doesn't do well with surprises, especially ones that challenge his worldview."
Nina placed the wooden spoon down and crossed the room, taking a seat beside him on their slate-gray couch. "I know who your father is, Matt, CEO of Collins Financial, fourth-generation wealth, country club membership." She took his hand, her wedding band catching the light, "and I know he has certain expectations about the kind of woman his son should marry." Matthew's jaw tightened. "His expectations stopped mattering to me a long time ago." "But they still hurt you," Nina said, her voice gentle but unflinching. This was her gift, seeing the truth beneath his careful composures. "And I need to know if you're ready for what happens next, because once we tell him, whatever he says, whatever he does, we face it together." Matthew squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar mix of gratitude and disbelief that this remarkable woman had chosen him, despite the complicated family he brought with him. "I'm ready," he said, picking up his phone again. "We are having dinner with them next weekend. It's time they knew." The grand foyer of the Collins estate in Woodside echoed with Matthew's footsteps as his father's housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, took his coat. The house hadn't changed. Imposing oil portraits of Collins patriarchs, antique furniture that was meant to be admired rather than used, the persistent smell of lemon polish and old money. "Matthew!" His mother, Elizabeth, appeared from the sitting room, martini glass in hand, despite it being barely past 5. She air-kissed his cheek, her blonde bob not moving an inch. "You look thin. Is that new startup of yours working you too hard?" "It's not a startup anymore, Mom. We're 4 years in with major clients," Matthew replied, the familiar dance beginning. "Where's Dad?" In his study, on a call with Tokyo. He'll be out shortly. Now, you mentioned you had news? Please tell me you've reconsidered that position at Collins Financial. The board seat is still— Mom, Matthew interrupted gently. That's not why I'm here. Richard Collins's voice boomed from the hallway before Elizabeth could press further. There he is. The prodigal returns to Silicon Valley royalty. His father entered, crystal tumbler of scotch in hand, silver hair perfectly coiffed, his casual weekend attire still managing to look like it cost more than most people's rent. Hello, Dad, Matthew said, accepting the firm handshake that had replaced hugs somewhere around his 12th birthday. They moved to the dining room, where Mrs. Abernathy had set out the first course. Matthew waited until his father had taken his customary seat at the head of the table before clearing his napkin. I have some news, he began, setting his napkin across his lap. I got married. The silence that followed was absolute. His mother's fork clattered against fine china. Married? Elizabeth finally managed. To whom? When?
Her name is Nina Ramirez, Matthew continued, his voice steadier than he felt. She's brilliant, has a double master's from Northwestern in human-computer interaction and psychology. We met at a conference last year, and he couldn't help the smile that crept onto his face. She's extraordinary. Ramirez, his father repeated, the name hanging in the air between them. That's Hispanic? Matthew met his father's gaze. Her parents came from Mexico. Her father served in the U.S. military before starting his own business in Chicago. Richard Collins' face hardened into the expression Matthew recognized from boardroom confrontations and golf club disagreements. And you didn't think to mention this relationship before rushing into marriage? It wasn't rushed, Dad. It was private. There's a difference. So private you couldn't invite your own family? Elizabeth's voice quavered. We didn't even get to see our only son get married. We kept it small, just her parents and her brother's family. Richard set down his tumbler with deliberate control. You chose her family over your own. That's not what happened, Matthew began, but his father cut him off. What happened is you made an impulsive decision that affects the Collins name without consideration for your family or our position in this community. Richard's voice was low, dangerous. Tell me, does she understand what it means to be a Collins? The responsibilities that come with it? She understands who I am better than anyone, Matthew replied, feeling heat rise in his neck. And what about children? Have you thought about what this means for the Collins legacy? Matthew stared at his father in disbelief. Are you seriously asking about the ethnicity of your potential grandchildren right now? I'm asking about your judgment, Matthew, about throwing away generations of what, Dad? Carefully cultivated social connections? Country club memberships? Matthew's voice rose despite his best intentions to stay calm. Nina is the best thing that's ever happened to me. She's brilliant, kind, driven, everything you should want for your son. Richard's face had gone cold. She's not part of our world, he said flatly. And until you come to your senses about this hasty decision, she's not welcome in my house. Matthew stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. Then I'm not welcome either. Matt, please, his mother pleaded, but he was already halfway to the door. He turned back one last time, looking at his father, powerful, stubborn, suddenly old in ways Matthew hadn't noticed before. One request, Matthew said, his voice steadier than he felt. Meet her father, just once, man to man. If you still feel the same way afterward, I'll never bring it up again. Richard stared at his son for a long moment. Fine, he finally said. Arrange it, but don't expect me to change my mind. As Matthew drove away from the estate, the weight on his chest both familiar and newly painful, he picked up his phone and called Nina.
How'd it go? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. About as well as we expected, he replied, merging onto the 280 freeway back toward the city. But he agreed to meet your father. There was a pause on the line. You really think that will change anything? Matthew thought about Ernesto Ramirez, the quiet dignity, the unwavering integrity, the way he'd welcomed Matthew into their family without reservation or judgment. "I think my father has never met anyone quite like yours," Matthew said, "and I think it's about time he did." If you've ever felt caught between family expectations and the life you truly want, you're not alone. This family drama is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when these two fathers finally meet. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell to catch Chapter 2, where worlds collide and long-held beliefs begin to unravel. Share your own family stories in the comments below. I read every single one. Chapter 2. The Other Side. Nina's childhood home in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the Collins estate. The modest two-story brick building with its well-tended window boxes full of marigolds and geraniums radiated something the Collins mansion, for all its grandeur, never had: warmth. Matthew parked their rental car along the street lined with mature elm trees, their leaves beginning to turn golden in the early October air. Through the bay window, he could see Nina's mother, Carmen, arranging something on the dining table. The familiar sight loosened the knot that had been tightening in his chest during the flight from San Francisco. "How'd it go?" she asked, her hand finding his across the center console. She wore a simple navy dress that brought out the amber flecks in her dark eyes, her grandmother's gold earrings catching the afternoon light. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" Matthew replied with a half-smile. "You're the one whose father is about to face the Richard Collins Inquisition." Nina's laugh was soft but confident. "My dad survived 2 tours in Desert Storm, started a business with $500 in his pocket, and raised 3 kids who never went without, even when he and Mom had to work 3 jobs between them." She squeezed his hand. "Trust me, he can handle one stubborn investment banker." They climbed the familiar steps to the porch, where Matthew had first asked permission to marry Nina, where they had announced their engagement over Carmen's famous pozole last Christmas. The door opened before they could knock, and Carmen enveloped them both in a fierce embrace that smelled of cinnamon and cloves. "Mija, Matthew, come in, come in!" She ushered them inside, where the house was alive with delicious aromas and the gentle notes of the old jazz records Ernesto played on Sundays. "Your father is in the backyard, checking on the grill. Your brother called. They're running late. Elena has a soccer tournament." The small living room was exactly as Matthew remembered. Family photos covering nearly every surface, well-worn but meticulously maintained furniture, books stacked on the coffee table. A home where people actually lived, not a showpiece designed to impress. "Can I help with anything, Carmen?" Matthew asked, already feeling the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. "You can take these drinks out to Ernesto." She handed him a tray with glasses of iced tea. "Nina, help me finish the salad?" Matthew made his way through the dining room to the back door, balancing the tray carefully. In the modest backyard with its carefully tended vegetable garden and string lights crisscrossing overhead, Ernesto Ramirez stood at the grill, his back straight despite his 65 years, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from decades of work. "Matthew!" Ernesto's face broke into a warm smile as he turned. "Right on time." They exchanged a firm handshake that turned into the brief embrace that had become their custom. Matthew set the drinks down on the nearby patio table. "Carmen's timing is perfect as always." Ernesto nodded toward the tea. "How was your flight?" "Fine. Thanks again for agreeing to this dinner, sir." Ernesto raised an eyebrow at the formality. "We're back to sir now?" He flipped the marinated skirt steak on the grill with practiced ease. "Your father must have really gotten under your skin." I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "That obvious, huh?" "Son, I've been reading People since before you were born. It's how I stayed alive in the desert. It's how I built my business when everyone said a Mexican couldn't make it in corporate security." He took a sip of tea. "And it's how I knew you were the right man for my Nina the moment you walked through our door." I felt the familiar wave of gratitude for this man who had welcomed me without reservation, who had never once made me feel like I needed to prove my worth. "He thinks she's not good enough," I said quietly, the admission burning in my throat. "Because of her name, because of where her family comes from." Ernesto was quiet for a moment, watching the smoke rise from the grill. "You know, when I first came to this country, I thought money was what made a man respected." He turned the meat again, his movements deliberate. "Took me years to learn that real respect isn't bought, it's earned. Through integrity, through how you treat others, through the legacy you build." He looked up at Matthew, his eyes sharp and clear. "Your father built his legacy one way. I built mine another. But a man who judges someone's worth by their name rather than their character?" Ernesto shook his head. "That man still has lessons to learn." "I'm not sure he's capable of learning them," I admitted.
"Everyone is capable of change, mijo," Ernesto replied. "The question is whether they're willing to face what's holding them back." He checked his watch. "What time will he be here?" As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Matthew's phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "They're here. Both of them." Matthew straightened, suddenly feeling like he was standing at the edge of a precipice. That would be now. Ernesto nodded, turning down the heat on the grill. "Then let's go meet the man who thinks he knows my daughter's worth better than I do." They walked back through the house to find Nina showing Richard and Elizabeth Collins into the living room. Matthew's parents looked starkly out of place among the warm colors and lived-in comfort of the Ramirez home. His father in a tailored casual blazer that probably cost more than Ernesto's first car. His mother clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Dad, Mom," Matthew said, stepping forward. "This is Ernesto Ramirez, Nina's father. Ernesto, my parents, Richard and Elizabeth Collins." Ernesto stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to our home." Richard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a pause that everyone in the room noticed, before taking Ernesto's hand. "Thank you for having us." Carmen appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You must be Matthew's parents. I'm Carmen. Please, come in, sit down. Dinner is almost ready." Elizabeth managed a tight smile. "What a charming home you have." "It's not much," Carmen replied with genuine warmth, "but we've filled it with love for 30 years now." "Can I get you something to drink?" Nina offered. "We have wine, beer, or my mom's famous horchata." "Just water, thank you," Richard replied stiffly. "I'll have some wine, if it's not too much trouble," Elizabeth added, glancing around at the family photos covering the walls. As Nina went to get the drinks, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Matthew caught his father staring at a shadow box on the wall. Inside was a purple heart medal, a folded flag, and a faded photograph of a younger Ernesto in desert fatigues. "You served?" Richard asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "Desert Storm," Ernesto replied. "First Armored Division, tank commander." "My father was in Korea, artillery officer." "Noble service," Ernesto nodded. "Different war. Same sacrifice." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Richard's posture. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was." Carmen clapped her hands together. "Dinner is ready. Please, everyone to the table." They moved to the dining room where the table was set with Carmen's best dishes, a colorful mismatched collection accumulated over decades. Steam rose from platters of grilled steak, roasted vegetables, and fresh tortillas. A bowl of Carmen's famous guacamole sat beside a platter of her homemade salsas.
The small living room was exactly as Matthew remembered. Family photos covering nearly every surface, well-worn but meticulously maintained furniture, books stacked on the coffee table. A home where people actually lived, not a showpiece designed to impress. "Can I help with anything, Carmen?" Matthew asked, already feeling the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. "You can take these drinks out to Ernesto." She handed him a tray with glasses of iced tea. "Nina, help me finish the salad?" Matthew made his way through the dining room to the back door, balancing the tray carefully. In the modest backyard with its carefully tended vegetable garden and string lights crisscrossing overhead, Ernesto Ramirez stood at the grill, his back straight despite his 65 years, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from decades of work. "Matthew!" Ernesto's face broke into a worn smile as he turned. Right on time. They exchanged a firm handshake that turned into the brief embrace that had become their custom. Matthew set the drinks down on the nearby patio table. "Carmen's timing is perfect as always." He nodded toward the tea. "How was your flight?" "Fine. Thanks again for agreeing to this dinner, sir." Ernesto raised an eyebrow at the formality. "We're back to sir now?" He flipped a marinated skirt steak on the grill with practiced ease. "Your father must have really gotten under your skin." Matthew exhaled, running his hand through his hair. "That obvious, huh?" "Son, I've been reading people since before you were born. It's how I stayed alive in the desert. It's how I built my business when everyone said a Mexican couldn't make it in corporate security." He took a sip of tea. "And it's how I knew you were the right man for my Nina the moment you walked through our door." Matthew felt the familiar wave of gratitude for this man who had welcomed him without reservation, who had never once made him feel like he needed to prove his worth. "He thinks she's not good enough," Matthew said quietly, the admission burning in his throat. "Because of her name, because of where her family comes from." Ernesto was quiet for a moment, watching the smoke rise from the grill. "You know, when I first came to this country, I thought money was what made a man respected. Took me years to learn that real respect isn't bought. It's earned, through integrity, through how you treat others, through the legacy you build." He looked up at Matthew, his eyes sharp and clear. "Your father built his legacy one way. I built mine another. But a man who judges someone's worth by their name rather than their character?" Ernesto shook his head. "That man still has lessons to learn." "I'm not sure he's capable of learning them," Matthew admitted.
Everyone is capable of change, mijo, Ernesto replied. The question is whether they're willing to face what's holding them back. He checked his watch. What time will he be here? As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Matthew's phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "They're here, both of them." Matthew straightened, suddenly feeling like he was standing at the edge of a precipice. That would be now. Ernesto nodded, turning down the heat on the grill. "Then let's go meet the man who thinks he knows my daughter's worth better than I do." They walked back through the house to find Nina showing Richard and Elizabeth Collins into the living room. Matthew's parents looked starkly out of place among the warm colors and lived-in comfort of the Ramirez home. His father in a tailored casual blazer that probably cost more than Ernesto's first car. His mother clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Dad, Mom," Matthew said, stepping forward. "This is Ernesto Ramirez, Nina's father. Ernesto, my parents, Richard and Elizabeth Collins." Ernesto stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to our home." Richard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a pause that everyone in the room noticed before taking Ernesto's hand. "Thank you for having us." Carmen appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You must be Matthew's parents. I'm got 'em in. Please, come in. Sit down. Dinner is almost ready." Elizabeth managed a tight smile. "What a charming home you have." "It's not much," Carmen replied with genuine warmth, "but we've filled it with love for 30 years now." "Can I get you something to drink?" Nina offered. "We have wine, beer, or my mom's famous horchata." "Just water, thank you," Richard replied stiffly. "I'll have some wine if it's not too much trouble," Elizabeth added, glancing around at the family photos covering the walls. As Nina went to get the drinks, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room.
Matthew caught his father staring at a shadow box on the wall. Inside was a purple heart medal, a folded flag, and a faded photograph of a younger Ernesto in desert fatigues. "You served?" Richard asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "Desert Storm, 1st Armored Division, tank commander. My father was in Korea, artillery officer. Noble service, different war, same sacrifice." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Richard's posture. "Yes," he said quietly, "it was." Carmen clapped her hands together. "Dinner is ready! Please, everyone to the table!" They moved to the dining room where the table was set with Carmen's best dishes, a colorful, mismatched collection accumulated over decades. Steam rose from platters of grilled steak, roasted vegetables, and fresh tortillas. A bowl of Carmen's famous guacamole sat beside a platter of her homemade salsas.
As they settled around the table, Matthew realized with a jolt that his father was seated directly across from Ernesto, his mother next to Carmen. The architectural precision of the Collins dinner parties replaced by the warm chaos of the Ramirez family table. "We usually say grace before meals," Carmen said gently. "Would that be all right with you?" Elizabeth looked startled. "Of course." They joined hands around the table, another Collins family foreign concept, and Ernesto spoke a simple blessing in Spanish before switching to English. "And Lord, we thank you for bringing our families together today. May we find common ground and understanding. Amen." "Amen," echoed around the table. As dishes were passed and plates filled, the initial tension began to thaw slightly. Carmen asked Elizabeth about her charity work, genuinely interested in the hospital foundation board she chaired. Nina shared stories about their honeymoon in Portugal, drawing reluctant smiles from both Collins' parents. It was when the conversation turned to work that Matthew noticed the first real shift. Richard, making a comment about market volatility, was surprised when Ernesto engaged knowledgeably on the topic. "You follow the markets?" Richard asked, poorly disguised surprise in his voice. "I built a security business from the ground up. Started with one contract and a borrowed van. Now we secure half the corporate buildings in downtown Chicago. You don't grow a company without understanding where your client's money comes from and where it might go." Richard studied Ernesto with new interest. Most security outfits are fly-by-night operations." "Not mine," Ernesto said simply. 25 years, same commitment to excellence. My clients trust me with their most valuable assets. That trust is earned through consistency, integrity, and results." He took a sip of his beer. "I imagine in your business it's much the same." Richard nodded slowly. "It is." Matthew caught Nina's eye across the table, a silent message passing between them. This small moment of connection between the fathers, built on mutual respect for competence, was exactly what he'd hoped for. The conversation continued, weaving between topics. Carmen brought out coffee and her famous tres leches cake. Elizabeth, after initial hesitation, asked for the recipe, seeming genuinely delighted when Carmen offered to email it to her. As the evening wound down, Matthew noticed his father had grown quieter, more observant. When Ernesto excused himself to check on something in the backyard, Richard, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. Nina squeezed Matthew's hand under the table. "Let them talk," she whispered. Out in the backyard, the two fathers stood side by side, looking up at the Chicago night sky, few stars visible through the city lights. Matthew watched through the window as words were exchanged, too distant to hear. But he could see his father's posture, the slight incline toward Ernesto, the thoughtful nod, the moment when both men seemed to laugh briefly about something. When they returned inside, Richard approached Nina directly for the first time that evening.
"Your father was telling me about your work in accessibility design," he said, "about how your research is changing how companies think about inclusive technology." Nina nodded, surprise flickering across her features. "It's important work. Technology should work for everyone, not just the privileged few." "He's very proud of you," Richard continued.
as he should be. The simple acknowledgement hung in the air, weighted with everything it represented, a concession, a beginning. As they prepared to leave, handshakes had evolved into brief hugs. Carmen pressed leftovers into Elizabeth's hands, despite her protests. Phone numbers were exchanged. At the door, Richard turned to Matthew and Nina. "We would like it if you both would come to dinner, next month when you're in town for that conference." He cleared his throat. "At our home." The words weren't an apology, but coming from Richard Collins, they were the closest thing to one that Matthew had ever heard. In the car ride back to their hotel, Nina rested her head on Matthew's shoulder. "Your father asked about my research, actually listened when I answered." "I saw," Matthew said, still processing the evening. "What do you think Ernesto said to him out there?" "Knowing my dad, something simple but true. That's his superpower, cutting through the noise to what really matters." Matthew thought about the shadow box on the wall, about the way Ernesto had built his business from nothing, about the quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. "Whatever it was," Matthew said, "I think it might have been exactly what my father needed to hear." Chapter 3. Collision Course. 3 weeks later, Matthew found himself driving the familiar winding roads to his parents' woodside estate, Nina beside him in the passenger seat. The autumn sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees, dappling the road ahead as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You're nervous," Nina observed, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. "I don't think I've ever seen you this tense before a client presentation, and you've pitched to Apple executives." I exhaled slowly, easing up on the accelerator as they approached the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to Collins' property. "Apple executives don't have baby pictures of me naked on a bearskin rug." Nina laughed, the sound helping to break the tension. "Fair point, but remember, we're not here to get our father's approval. We're here because he extended an olive branch, and we're mature enough to accept it." The gate swung open automatically, security cameras tracking their approach. Matthew nodded at the guard stationed at the entrance, a new addition since his last visit. His father had grown increasingly paranoid about security in recent years, a fact that struck Matthew as ironic, given his dismissive attitude towards Ernesto's security business.
"I just want to get through this dinner without anyone storming out," Matthew admitted as they pulled up to the circular driveway. That would count as a win in the Collins family record book. As they approached the massive front door, it swung open to reveal not Mrs. Abernathy, but Elizabeth Collins herself, dressed in a casual but unmistakably expensive cashmere sweater set. "Matthew, Nina," she greeted them with a smile that seemed less practiced than usual. "Come in, come in." The foyer was filled with the scent of something unexpected, actual cooking, rather than the catered meals that had been the Collins standard for as long as Matthew could remember. "Mom, are you cooking?" Matthew asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice as he handed their coats to Mrs. Abernathy, who appeared silently from a side hallway. "Well, attempting to," Elizabeth admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "Carmen sent me that tres leches recipe, and I thought I'd try my hand at it, though I'm afraid it doesn't quite look like hers." The casual mention of Nina's mother by his own felt so foreign to Matthew that he almost missed the significance of what was happening. His mother, who ordered in from Michelin-starred restaurants rather than use her state-of-the-art kitchen, was baking. "I'm sure it's wonderful," Nina said warmly. "My mom would be so touched that you tried her recipe." Elizabeth brightened at this. "Would you like to see it? It's cooling in the kitchen now." As his mother led Nina toward the kitchen, a room Matthew wasn't sure his mother had spent more than 20 minutes in during his entire childhood, he caught sight of his father emerging from his study. Richard Collins looked different somehow, not physically. He was still impeccably dressed in tailored casual wear, silver hair perfectly styled, but there was something in his bearing that Matthew couldn't quite place. "Son," Richard greeted him with a firm handshake that lingered a moment longer than usual. "Good to see you." "You too, Dad," he replied, studying his father's face for any sign of the coldness that had marked their last encounter. Instead, he found something unexpected. Uncertainty. Richard Collins, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, the man who made decisions affecting thousands of lives without a second thought, looked unsure of himself in his own home. "Should we join the ladies in the kitchen?" Richard suggested, gesturing down the hallway. "Your mother has been baking all afternoon. I haven't seen her this determined since she chaired the hospital gala last year." In the kitchen, they found Elizabeth showing Nina the cake she'd prepared, both women laughing as Elizabeth recounted how she'd had to send Mrs. Abernathy to 3 different stores to find the specific condensed milk Carmen's recipe called for. "I thought you could just use any brand, but Carmen was very specific in her instructions."
Mom is very serious about her ingredients, Nina agreed, helping Elizabeth transfer the cake to a serving platter. "When I was little, she would drive 40 minutes to the Mexican market on the other side of Chicago rather than use the wrong kind of chiles." "That's dedication," Elizabeth replied with genuine admiration. "I've never had that kind of patience with cooking." "It wasn't just patience," Nina explained, her voice warm with memory. "For her, making food from scratch was how she kept Mexico alive in our home. Every dish was a story about where she came from, what her mother taught her." Elizabeth's expression turned thoughtful. "I never thought of cooking that way, as a connection to your heritage." Matthew caught his father watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, but the atmosphere was noticeably different from their last meal here. Elizabeth had clearly gone to great lengths to make the setting less intimidating. Fresh flowers from the garden rather than the usual rigid arrangements, candles casting a warm glow across the table, even place settings that looked less formal than the Collins standard. As they settled around the table, Richard cleared his throat. "I took the liberty of selecting a wine that I thought might complement our meal. It's from a small vineyard in Napa, family-owned for generations. The owner reminded me somewhat of your father, Nina, a man of strong principles who built something lasting." Nina's surprise was evident, but she recovered quickly. "That sounds wonderful. My father would be honored by the comparison." As Richard poured the wine, Matthew caught Nina's eye across the table. There was cautious optimism in her expression that matched his own tentative hope. The conversation through the first course remained carefully neutral, discussing the unusually warm autumn, Nina and Matthew's recent work projects, Elizabeth's charity commitments. It wasn't until the main course was served that Richard steered into more personal territory. "Nina," he began, setting down his fork deliberately, "I understand from our conversation in Chicago that your company is developing accessibility features for major tech platforms." Nina nodded, her professional confidence evident. "Yes, we're working with several major companies to redesign their interfaces for users with visual impairments. It's an underserved market that represents millions of potential customers. And this was your initiative?" "It was, after my grandmother began losing her vision, but still wanted to use video chat to see her grandchildren. The existing tools were frustrating for her, so I started researching better solutions." Richard nodded thoughtfully, taking a personal problem and finding a market solution. That's good business sense.
Matthew nearly choked on his wine. His father, who had dismissed Nina's career as playing with computers during their last encounter, was now praising her business acumen. "Your father mentioned you were one of the first in your family to attend college," Richard continued. "Northwestern, correct? That's a competitive school." "It is," Nina agreed. "I was fortunate to receive a full academic scholarship." "Nothing fortunate about it," Richard countered, surprising everyone at the table. "Scholarships like that are earned through hard work and ability. I should know. I sit on several foundation boards that award them." Elizabeth jumped in, perhaps sensing Nina's surprise at Richard's change in tone. "Nina, Matthew tells us your brother is considering colleges for his daughter. Alina, is it?" "Yes," Nina smiled, clearly touched that Elizabeth had remembered her niece's name. "She's a soccer star, being recruited by several Division I schools."
The Collins Foundation has a scholarship program for student athletes, Richard said casually. If she's as impressive as you say, we'd be happy to have her apply. I could make some calls. Matthew set down his glass carefully, trying to process what he was hearing. His father, who 3 weeks ago had declared Nina unwelcome in this very house, was now offering to help her niece with college scholarships. Nina handled the moment with grace. That's incredibly generous, Richard. I know my brother would be touched by the offer. The conversation continued to flow with surprising ease. Elizabeth asked thoughtful questions about Nina's family traditions. Richard inquired about Ernesto's business expansion plans with what seemed like genuine interest. There were moments of awkwardness, certainly, but nothing like the cold hostility of their previous dinner. It was during dessert, Elizabeth's attempt at tres leches cake, which was actually quite good despite her protests to the contrary, that Richard finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I owe you both an apology," he said suddenly, setting down his fork with deliberate care. The table fell silent, even Elizabeth looking at her husband with surprise. Richard Collins was not a man who apologized, ever. Matthew had seen his father make catastrophic business decisions that cost people their livelihoods without expressing a shred of regret. "My reaction to your marriage was—" Richard paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Short-sighted and unfair to you both, particularly to you, Nina." Nina's expression remained composed, though Matthew could see the emotion in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that, Richard." "Your father and I had a conversation in Chicago," Richard continued, glancing at Matthew. "He said something that has stayed with me these past weeks." Matthew leaned forward slightly, finally about to hear what had transpired between the two men in the backyard.
"He told me that the measure of a man isn't in what he accumulates, but in what he builds that outlasts him." Richard's voice had none of its usual commanding presence. Instead, there was a reflective quality Matthew had rarely heard. He spoke about legacy, about how his greatest achievement wasn't his business, but his children, who carry forward his values of hard work, integrity, and service. Richard looked directly at Nina now. He said he knew his daughter had chosen well because you, Matthew, saw her true worth from the beginning. Something he said spoke to how we had raised you, despite our differences. Matthew felt a tightness in his chest, thinking of Ernesto finding something to praise about him to his father, even after how the Collins family had initially treated Nina. "I've spent my life building financial legacies," Richard continued, "but I've given far less thought to what values I'm passing on." He turned to Matthew. "When you walked away from Collins Financial to start your own company, I saw it as rejection. Your father-in-law helped me see it differently, as you carrying forward the entrepreneurial spirit I've always valued, just in your own way." The admission hung in the air, weighted with years of unspoken tension between father and son. "Dad," Matthew began, but Richard raised a hand. "Let me finish, son." He took a breath. "I've been wrong about many things, but I was most wrong about Nina, about what she brings to this family." He lifted his glass. "So I'd like to propose a toast to both of you, to your marriage, and to the future of the Collins family, which is brighter with you in it, Nina." They raised their glasses, the crystal catching the candlelight. Matthew felt Nina's free hand find his under the table, squeezing tightly. "To family," Elizabeth added, her eyes suspiciously bright. As they finished their dessert and moved to the sitting room for coffee, Matthew noticed his father hanging back, gesturing for him to wait a moment. "There's something else," Richard said when they were alone. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my mother's." He opened it to reveal an antique diamond ring, the stones arranged in an intricate pattern around the central sapphire. "I know you and Nina already have wedding bands," Richard said, uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "But this has been passed down through the Collins family for generations. It would mean a great deal to me, to us, if Nina would accept it." as a welcome to the family. Matthew stared at the ring, then at his father. This particular family heirloom had been a topic of conversation throughout his childhood, the Collins bride ring, meant for the woman who would carry on the family name. "Dad, Matthew began, emotion making it difficult to find the right words. "You don't have to decide now," Richard said quickly. "Discuss it with Nina. It's her choice, of course." Matthew nodded, closing the box and slipping it into his own pocket. "Thank you. This means a lot." Richard Collins, never comfortable with emotional moments, simply clapped his son on the shoulder before they rejoined the others.
Later, as they drove back to their hotel, Nina leaned her head against the passenger window, watching the lights of Woodside blur past. "Your father apologized," she said finally, wonder in her voice. "Richard Collins actually apologized." "I'm still trying to process it," Matthew admitted. "In 35 years, I've never heard him admit he was wrong about anything." "My dad has that effect on people," Nina smiled, turning to face him. "He doesn't try to change minds with arguments. He just lives his truth so authentically that it makes others question their own assumptions." Matthew was quiet for a moment, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching into his pocket to feel the outline of the velvet box. "There's something else," he said finally. "My father gave me something for you." Nina raised her eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "No," Matthew laughed softly. It's a big deal, coming from him." He briefly explained about the ring, careful to emphasize that it was entirely her choice whether to accept it. Nina was silent for several moments, watching the road ahead. "What would it mean to you," she finally asked, "if I wore your family's ring?" Matthew considered the question carefully. Growing up, that ring symbolized everything complicated about being a Collins: the expectations, the legacy, the pressure to maintain appearances. He glanced at her, but seeing it tonight, in this context, it felt different. Like maybe we could redefine what being part of this family means. Make it our own. Nina reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then I would be honored to wear it. Not as a Collins bride, but as Nina Ramirez Collins, on my terms." As they continued toward San Francisco, Matthew felt something shift between them, not just between him and Nina, but in the larger architecture of their families. Something foundation deep and permanent. "Your father asked about Thanksgiving," Nina mentioned casually, "whether we might consider hosting both families in our apartment." Matthew nearly swerved. "He what? Our place barely fits 6 people for dinner." "I know," Nina laughed. "I think that's partly why he suggested it, to experience something completely outside his comfort zone." Richard Collins eating turkey at our IKEA dining table. Now that's something I never thought I'd see. As the city lights came into view, Matthew felt a weight lifting, one he'd carried for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. The road ahead wasn't perfectly clear, but for the first time, it felt wide open with possibility. Chapter 4. Bridges. The weeks following the dinner at the Collins estate brought subtle but meaningful changes. Elizabeth called Nina directly to ask about Thanksgiving menu suggestions. Richard forwarded information about the Collins Foundation scholarship to Nina's brother. Small gestures, but significant ones.
Matthew noticed the shift in his own relationship with his father as well. Their weekly phone calls, once stilted affairs focused entirely on business, now included questions about Nina, about their life together. Richard even asked about the accessibility project Nina was spearheading, offering to connect her with potential investors. It was during one such call, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, that Richard cleared his throat in that particular way that signaled he was about to say something he found difficult. "Your mother and I were thinking," he began, uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "Rather than having Thanksgiving at your apartment, perhaps we could try something different." Matthew braced himself, assuming his father was backing out of the plans. Different how? We thought we might invite everyone to the house in Tahoe. It's spacious enough for both families, and the mountains are beautiful this time of year. Matthew nearly dropped the phone. The Tahoe house was his father's sanctuary, a place Richard Collins retreated to when he needed to escape the pressures of his position. Matthew could count on one hand the number of non-family members who had been invited there over the years. "Everyone?" Matthew repeated. "You mean Nina's family too?" "Of course," Richard replied, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. Carmen mentioned that Elena, Nina's niece, has never seen snow. The Tahoe house would be perfect, if they're amenable, of course. Matthew sat down heavily on the couch, trying to process this new development. "I'll need to discuss it with Nina, and she'd need to talk to her parents." "Certainly," Richard agreed. "Just let us know soon so we can make the arrangements." After hanging up, Matthew stared at his phone for several long moments before calling Nina at her office. "You're not going to believe what my father just suggested," he began when she answered. The Tahoe house stood on the north shore of the lake, its grand windows reflecting the snow-covered mountains that surrounded it. Built of massive timber and local stone, it rose from the landscape like a natural extension of the mountainside itself. A dusting of fresh snow covered the sloping roofline, and smoke curled invitingly from the central chimney. Matthew pulled their rented SUV into the circular driveway behind his parents' vehicle. Nina's family would be arriving shortly. They'd flown into Reno, where a car service Richard had arranged would bring them the rest of the way. "It's beautiful," Nina breathed, taking in the view of the frozen lake beyond the house. "You never mentioned your family had a place like this." "It's always been my father's personal retreat. I think I've been here maybe a dozen times in my life." Before we could reach the front door, it swung open to reveal Elizabeth Collins in a casual sweater and slacks, another departure from her usual formal attire.
"You made it!" she exclaimed, hugging them both with uncharacteristic warmth. Come in, come in! Your father's just building up the fire." The great room of the Tahoe house was exactly as Matthew remembered. Soaring ceilings supported by massive exposed beams, a wall of windows overlooking the lake, and a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. Richard was indeed arranging logs in the fire, his sleeves rolled up, looking oddly domestic. "Perfect timing," he greeted them, dusting his hands off. "The Ramirez family should be here within the hour. I've had Mrs. Peters stock the kitchen with everything Carmen might need. I hope that wasn't presumptuous." "I'm sure she'll appreciate it," Nina assured him, still taking in the grandeur of the house. "This place is incredible, Richard." "It's been in the family for 3 generations," he explained with evident pride. "My grandfather built it back when this shoreline was mostly undeveloped. We've updated it over the years, of course, but we've tried to maintain the original character." Elizabeth appeared with mugs of hot cider, leading them to the seating area near the fire. "Nina, I've put your parents in the East Wing guest suite. It has the best view of the sunrise over the lake. Your brother and his family will be in the adjoining rooms." Matthew caught Nina's eye, both of them slightly overwhelmed by this new, hyper-accommodating version of his mother. "That sounds perfect, thank you. My mom packed some special ingredients for the dishes she wants to make. She was so excited about cooking with you." Elizabeth beamed at this. "I've cleared the entire kitchen for us. Your mother promised to teach me how to make proper tamales. I've never made anything more complicated than a roast chicken before this tres leches adventure." The sound of tires on the gravel driveway interrupted them. Richard stood immediately, straightening his casual sweater. "They're here." Matthew found himself holding his breath as his father went to the door. The last time the fathers had been together had been that pivotal night in Chicago. Since then, communication had been through the younger generation, polite messages passed back and forth, arrangements made through Nina and Matthew. Nina squeezed his hand. "It's going to be fine," she whispered. The front door opened to a flurry of activity. Carmen exclaiming over the beauty of the surroundings, Elena bouncing with excitement about the snow, Nina's brother Antonio helping his wife with their bags, and in the center of it all, Ernesto Ramirez, shaking Richard's hand with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. "Welcome to Tahoe," Richard was saying, helping Carmen with her coat.
I hope the drive wasn't too tiring." "It was beautiful," Carmen replied enthusiastically. "I've never seen mountains like this before." Elena, Nina's 16-year-old niece, rushed forward to hug her aunt. "Tia Nina, this place is amazing. Dad says there's a private dock with boats for the summer and a game room downstairs."
Antonio approached more sedately, embracing his sister before shaking Matthew's hand warmly. "Quite a place your family has here," he said, impressed despite himself. "The Collins family has been very generous to invite us," Ernesto said, his voice carrying easily through the room as he moved to stand beside Richard. The two men, similar in height but so different in bearing, made a striking contrast against the backdrop of the stone fireplace. "It's our pleasure," Richard replied, and to Matthew's surprise, he seemed to genuinely mean it. "I thought we might all enjoy a change of scenery for the holiday." "A beautiful one," Ernesto agreed, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "My father would never have believed that his son would one day stand in a place like this as a guest rather than staff." The comment might have created tension, but Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Times change, as they should." "And people?" Ernesto asked quietly, his gaze direct. "Some faster than others," Richard admitted, with a self-deprecating smile that Matthew had rarely seen. "But yes, they change too." Elizabeth clapped her hands together. "Let's get everyone settled in their rooms, and then Carmen and I need to start on the turkey if we're going to have it ready for tomorrow." As the group dispersed, Elizabeth showing Carmen to the kitchen, Antonio and his wife following Mrs. Peters to their rooms, Elena already dragging her grandfather outside to see the snow, Matthew found himself alone with Nina and their fathers. "I thought perhaps we might take the boat out," Richard suggested, surprising everyone. "Just a quick tour of the lake before dinner." "In this weather?" Matthew asked, dubiously, glancing out at the snow flurries. "The covered pontoon has heating, and the lake is particularly beautiful with the mountain snow covered." Ernesto nodded. "I'd like that. I've never been on a boat in snow before." The four of them bundled up and made their way down to the private dock where the Collins family kept several boats. Richard led them to a large covered pontoon vessel with clear vinyl sides that could be rolled down to protect against the elements. As they pulled away from the dock, the magnitude of the lake became apparent. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. The water was a deep, impossible blue, reflecting the winter sky. "I've always found peace here," Richard said quietly, as he navigated away from the shoreline. "Something about the scale of it all puts things in perspective." Ernesto nodded, gazing out at the panorama. "Nature has a way of reminding us how small our concerns really are." They cruised in comfortable silence for a while, Richard occasionally pointing out landmarks, a historic estate hidden among the trees, the old lighthouse at the harbor entrance. Matthew and Nina sat close together on one of the cushioned benches, watching their fathers with a mixture of amazement and cautious hope.
"I understand you were quite the fisherman in your younger days," Richard said to Ernesto as they rounded a wooded point. "Still am," Ernesto replied with a smile, "though mostly catch and release these days. My father taught me on Lake Michigan when I was a boy. Said a man who can sit quietly enough to catch fish has the patience for anything life throws at him." "Wise man," Richard nodded. "My father was the same way. Some of my earliest memories are of fishing with him, right here on this lake." Matthew exchanged a glance with Nina. Their fathers, finding common ground in memories of their own fathers. It was unexpected, and somehow perfect. "I never took Matthew fishing enough," Richard continued, a note of regret in his voice. "Always too busy with the firm." "It's not too late," Ernesto said simply. "He's right here." Richard's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Perhaps you're right." He glanced back at Matthew. "What do you say, son? Early morning fishing tomorrow before the Thanksgiving chaos?" Matthew, caught off guard by the suggestion, nodded. "I'd like that, Dad." "I could join you, show you both my secret technique for landing the big ones." "It's settled then," Richard declared, turning the boat back toward the dock as the snow began to fall more heavily. "A Collins-Ramirez fishing expedition."
As they tied up at the dock and made their way back to the house, Nina fell into step beside her father, linking her arm through his. "Having a good time, Dad?" she asked softly. "Better than I expected," Ernesto admitted. "Your father-in-law is not who I thought he was. He's changed, because of you, I think." "No, mija. If he's changing, it's because he wants to. A man like Richard Collins doesn't change for anyone but himself. But sometimes all people need is permission to become who they truly want to be." Ahead of them, Matthew walked alongside his father, their conversation too low to hear. But something in the way Richard's hand rested briefly on Matthew's shoulder spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Carmen and Elizabeth took command of the kitchen, their initial awkwardness giving way to genuine collaboration as they prepared for the next day's feast. Elena convinced her grandfather to help her build a snowman on the back lawn, while Antonio and his wife explored the game room with Richard, who turned out to be surprisingly competitive at pool. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Matthew stood at the window of their suite, watching the moonlight play across the frozen surface of the lake. "A penny for your thoughts?" Nina said softly, coming to stand beside him. "I was just thinking about how unlikely all of this is. My father was refusing to let you into his house 3 months ago. Now he's planning fishing trips with your dad and hosting your entire family for Thanksgiving." "People can surprise you," Nina said, leaning into him. "Even Richard Collins."
I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Matthew admitted, for him to say or do something that ruins it all. Maybe there is no other shoe, Nina suggested. Maybe this is just growth. Matthew thought about his father's face as he had talked about fishing with his own father, the unguarded nostalgia, the hint of regret. Perhaps Nina was right. Perhaps Richard Collins, for all his stubborn pride, was finally allowing himself to change. "Either way," Matthew said, pulling her closer, "I'm grateful. For this moment, for your family, for you." "For us," Nina corrected, turning to face him, "our family now. All of them." Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering everything in a blanket of silent white, the perfect clean slate. Chapter 5. Legacies. Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow glittering in the early light. True to his word, Richard roused Matthew before sunrise, and they met Ernesto on the dock, bundled against the chill, fishing gear in hand. "Perfect conditions," Richard declared, helping Ernesto into the small fishing boat. "The lake's like glass this time of morning." Matthew, still half asleep, accepted the thermos of coffee his father pressed into his hands. "Have you two been planning this? You seem awfully coordinated for 6 in the morning." The fathers exchanged a glance that Matthew couldn't quite interpret. "Let's just say we've been comparing notes," Ernesto replied with a small smile. "Your father called me last week to discuss the best spots and tackle for lake trout this time of year." Matthew nearly spilled his coffee. The idea of Richard Collins and Ernesto Ramirez having fishing strategy calls behind their backs was almost too surreal to process. They pushed off from the dock, Richard at the motor, guiding them toward a secluded cove on the far side of the lake. The mountains rose around them, their peaks catching the first golden rays of sunrise, while the water remained in shadow, dark and mysterious below. "My father brought me to this same spot when I was about 10, Richard said, as he cut the motor, letting them drift into position. "He said it was a Collins family secret, where the biggest trout in the lake hide." He showed them how to set up their lines, baiting hooks with practiced efficiency. Matthew, who had fished perhaps 3 times in his life, fumbled with the tackle until Ernesto gently took over, demonstrating the technique with patient hands. "Like this," he said, guiding Matthew's fingers, "smooth and confident. Fish can sense hesitation." "That's true in business, too," Richard observed, casting his line with a perfect arc. "Confidence is half the battle." "And the other half?" Ernesto asked, settling back as his line disappeared into the dark water. "Knowing when to be patient. Something I haven't always been good at." They fished in companionable silence as the sun rose fully over the mountains, casting long golden light across the lake. Matthew found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the gentle rocking of the boat, the occasional adjustment of the line, and the shared quiet that felt more comfortable than awkward.
"Nina tells me you're expanding your business, Ernesto," Richard said after a while. "New contracts in the financial sector?" Ernesto nodded. "3 major banks in the Midwest. The challenge is scaling without losing the personal touch that built our reputation." "A challenge indeed," Richard agreed. "I've seen too many good companies lose their soul in expansion." "Like Collins Financial?" Matthew asked before he could stop himself. Instead of bristling as he once would have, Richard considered the question thoughtfully. "Perhaps," he admitted. "When my father ran the company, he knew every employee by name, their spouses, their children. By the time I took over, that was impossible. We had offices in 12 countries. But you traded something for that growth," Ernesto observed. "It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact." "Yes," Richard agreed, though I didn't see it that way at the time. Success has a way of blinding you to what you're losing along the way." Matthew stared at his father, startled by the admission. Richard Collins had spent decades defending every business decision he'd ever made, regardless of the consequences. A sudden tug on Matthew's line interrupted the moment. "I think I've got something," he exclaimed, nearly dropping the rod in surprise. "Easy," Ernesto coached, moving beside him. "Steady pressure." "Let it run if it needs to," Richard added, setting his own rod aside. "Then reel when it tires." Under their combined guidance, Matthew fought the fish for several exhilarating minutes before finally bringing it alongside the boat, a beautiful lake trout, silver blue and thrashing. "That's a good one," Richard said with genuine pride, helping Matthew net it. "Must be 5 pounds at least." "Your first big catch," Ernesto smiled. "Your father and I will have to work to top that today." Matthew held the fish carefully, feeling its strength as it fought against his grip. "Should we keep it? For dinner?" Richard and Ernesto exchanged another of those unreadable glances. "That's your call. It's your fish," Richard said. Matthew studied the creature, thinking about what it represented. This unlikely morning, these improbable connections being forged across generations and backgrounds. "I think I'd rather let it go," he decided. "Back to its family." Richard nodded, helping him remove the hook and release the trout back into the clear water. They watched it disappear into the depths, a flash of silver quickly swallowed by blue. "A good choice," Ernesto said quietly. "There's honor in catching, but there's wisdom in releasing." They fished for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily now. Richard spoke about his own father, a harder man than even Richard himself, shaped by the Depression and war. Ernesto shared stories of crossing the border as a teenager, determined to build something his parents could be proud of. Matthew found himself opening up about the pressures he'd felt growing up as the Collins heir, and his decision to forge his own path. By the time they returned to the dock, they had caught and released 6 fish between them, and formed something that felt remarkably like friendship. The house was alive with activity when they returned, delicious smells wafting from the kitchen, music playing, Elena and her mother decorating the massive dining table with pine cones and candles. Carmen and Elizabeth worked side by side at the kitchen island, flour dusting their clothes as they shaped masa for tamales. "The fishermen return," Carmen called out. "Any luck?" "Matthew caught the biggest one," Ernesto reported proudly. "A natural, just needed the right teachers." Nina appeared from the living room, her face brightening at the sight of them together. "You're just in time. Mom and Elizabeth need taste testers for the cranberry salsa." The day unfolded in a warm blur of food preparation, family stories, and moments that would have seemed impossible just months before. Richard teaching Elena how to play chess on his father's antique set, Carmen showing Elizabeth her secret technique for perfect tamales. Antonio and Matthew discovered a shared passion for vintage motorcycles. When they finally gathered around the enormous dining table, laden with a magnificent turkey, Carmen's tamales, Elizabeth's roasted vegetables, and countless other dishes that represented both family traditions, Richard rose to offer a toast. "I've hosted many Thanksgiving dinners in this house, but never one that felt quite like this." He paused, and Matthew was startled to see his father looking emotional, something he could count on one hand having witnessed before. "The Collins family has always valued legacy," Richard continued. "But I think, perhaps, we've been too narrow in our definition of what that means." He raised his glass. "Today, I'm grateful for new perspectives, for second chances, and for the expansion of our family in ways I never expected." "Hear, hear," Ernesto responded, raising his own glass. "To family, not defined by blood alone, but by the courage to grow together." As they ate, stories flowed freely around the table. Carmen shared tales of her childhood in Mexico City. Elizabeth spoke about her early days with Richard when Collins Financial was still a small regional firm. Antonio and his wife recounted Elena's first soccer game, where she scored 3 goals and declared she would play professionally someday. "Speaking of Elena's future," Richard said during a lull in the conversation, "I've taken the liberty of speaking with the athletic director at Northwestern, my alma mater. They're very interested in her soccer career." Elena's eyes widened. "Really? Northwestern is on my dream school list." "Nothing's guaranteed, of course," Richard added quickly, "but they've agreed to send a scout to your spring tournament." Antonio looked surprised. "That's incredibly generous, Richard. Thank you." "Not at all," Richard waved away the thanks. "The Collins Foundation has always supported promising young talent, and family connections don't hurt."
The casual inclusion of Elena in family connections wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Matthew caught Nina's eye across the candlelight, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. After dinner, as they all migrated to the great room, where a fire roared in the massive stone fireplace, Matthew noticed his father draw Ernesto aside. The two men spoke quietly by the windows, occasionally glancing back at the gathering. Whatever they discussed seemed serious but not tense, their expressions thoughtful rather than confrontational. "What do you think that's about?" Matthew murmured to Nina as they helped Carmen arrange dessert plates. Nina shrugged. "With those two? Could be fishing strategies or solving the Middle East crisis. They've become quite the pair." Later, as the evening wound down, families beginning to drift toward their rooms, Richard cleared his throat for attention. "Before we end this wonderful day," he said, "Ernesto and I have something we'd like to share with you all." The room quieted, all eyes turning to the two fathers standing side by side before the fireplace. "Ernesto and I have been discussing a project, something that would combine our respective talents." Ernesto nodded. "We're calling it the Collins Ramirez Initiative, a foundation focused on supporting first-generation college students and entrepreneurs from immigrant backgrounds. Using my financial expertise and Ernesto's community connections, we believe we can create something meaningful that serves both our families' values." Matthew stared at his father in astonishment. Richard Collins, who had once dismissed Nina's family background, was now creating a foundation specifically to support people from similar circumstances. The foundation will provide not just scholarships, but mentorship, business incubation, and networking opportunities. "And," Richard said, looking directly at Matthew and Nina, "we'd like you both to serve on the board, to help shape this legacy that belongs to both our families now." The room erupted in excited conversation. Carmen hugged Elizabeth, both women wiping away tears. Antonio began firing questions about structure and funding models. Elena declared she wanted to volunteer during summer breaks. In the midst of the commotion, Matthew made his way to where his father stood. "Dad," he began, struggling to find the right words, I don't know what to say." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything. This isn't about words anymore. It's about actions." He glanced across the room at Nina, who was embracing her father. "She changed our family, Matthew, for the better." "She did," Matthew agreed. "But so did you, Dad, by being willing to change." Richard's expression softened in a way Matthew had rarely seen. "I've made many mistakes in my life, son. Most of them involved prioritizing the wrong things." He squeezed Matthew's shoulder. "I'm just grateful it's not too late to correct course."
Later that night, after most of the family had retired to their rooms, Matthew and Nina stood on the back deck, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the moonlight on the snow. "Did you know about this foundation idea?" Matthew asked, still processing the evening's announcement. Nina shook her head. "Not a clue, though it explains all those mysterious phone calls my dad's been taking lately." "It's like we've stepped into an alternate universe," Matthew marveled. "Richard Collins and Ernesto Ramirez, philanthropy partners." "Not so strange, really," Nina replied, leaning against him. "They're both builders at heart. They just built different things in different ways." Matthew thought about the morning on the lake, about the unexpected wisdom his father had shared, about Ernesto's quiet dignity that had somehow penetrated decades of Collins' family armor. "When I first brought you home," he said softly, "I never imagined we'd end up here." "Here is a pretty good place to be," Nina replied, gazing out at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. From inside, they could hear the faint sounds of the family they had created, Carmen and Elizabeth laughing in the kitchen, Elena playing the piano Richard had encouraged her to try, the low murmur of the fathers' voices still deep in conversation about their new shared vision. "I used to think family was something you were born into, something fixed and unchangeable. And now?" she asked, looking up at him. "Now I think it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, something that can grow in ways you never expected if you're brave enough to let it." Nina smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I like that definition better." Inside the house, a camera flashed as someone captured a moment. Laughter followed, warm and genuine. The sound of barriers falling, of new connections being forged, of a family expanding beyond blood and background to something richer and more complex. "We should go back in," Nina said, after a moment. "Be part of it." Matthew nodded, taking her hand as they turned toward the golden light spilling from the windows, toward the improbable family that had formed when one man had simply said, "Then meet her father, just once." If this story touched your heart, you're part of a community that understands the power of family, both the ones we're born into and the ones we create. Each of your stories matters too. Subscribe now to join our growing family and never miss a chapter of these emotional journeys that remind us what truly matters in life. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that change is possible, that bridges can be built between the most unlikely people when love leads the way. Until next time, remember that the most beautiful legacies aren't built of money or status, but of courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together.